thinking about trauma and how people get stuck on something a long time ago that keeps them from moving on with their life. And that issue continues to really preoccupy me, because since that time I've met thousands of people, and the clinic we've met thousands of people who get stuck and who do not seem to be able to go on. And instead of being helpless and frozen this time, they take action and poke the guy's eyes out, or kick the shin from underneath him, and he falls to the floor and said, I did it. And so overcoming trauma is about really regaining your power and becoming fully alive and saying, I can do it. I'm not helpless. And so a large part of that is really regaining a sense of being in your body, and owning a sense of I can do it and I'm in charge of my life. I was delighted when Marla invited me to speak here, and amazed that so many people show up. On an evening you can hear even more foolish things out of people's mouths, out of Republican candidates, and so I'll try to give you a moment of sanity before the later events of the evening. Usually when I talk I show brain slides and videotapes of things, but I sort of thought I'd treat this as a book reading about this book. Part of it inspired this book is that I trained at the Mass Mental Health Center, which is now defunct and revived. And I was the last superintendent of Boston State Hospital, so I go back to ancient times in psychiatry. One of the first patients I ever saw was the former head of internal medicine at the Massachusetts General Hospital. It's this frail old 93-year-old man. And I sat there as a young psychiatrist, and he was brilliant, and he knew so much. And I thought to myself, how is it possible that this man will probably croak 2 or 3 years from now and take all this wisdom into his grave? And I sort of must have had a seed of, before I croak, I want to put some of the wisdom I have accumulated on a piece of paper, so it doesn't necessarily disappear. And in the past 2 years, since I wrote this book, I've been really encouraging all my friends who are becoming to sort of come to a certain age of wisdom, put it down on paper. Don't take it with you. Nobody will be able to use it. Because one of the things I'm impressed with, some of the people in the room will know that, is that at a certain moment you learn something. And just as you learn something, nobody is interested in what you have to say anymore. Has anyone ever noticed that? Like my kids, they're wonderful kids and bright and brilliant and lovely, but they really don't know anything nearly as much as we do. But people find my kids a hell of a lot more interesting to talk to than me. So you have to write books, and you have to come to meetings like this. And so my book is really about, it has many functions. One of the functions is that we have learned a lot about what drives people crazy. And to a large degree, as you probably know from experience, people drive people crazy. But we also know, and keep ignoring, is that we have learned a lot about the brain. And we have all the information about the brain, and what people keep ignoring is that what we have brains for. We have brains to play together, to work together, to talk with each other, to collaborate with each other, to think together. Our brain is a totally social brain. We don't exist as individuals. And something really weird happened in psychiatry, and that is that people are talked about as little organisms that have nothing to do with anybody else, and that if something goes wrong, it just happens to you because you're messed up, and it has nothing to do with where you come from. But it's also interesting that a number of us have kids, and not all of our kids come out as perfect kids. And I know a large number of people, including myself, who had quite imperfect kids. And then when you're a relatively privileged, educated, anti-authoritarian person, you really try to make your kids do well. And by and large, what's been great to see in my environment is that most parents who I know who had difficult kids, their kids have grown up to be okay adults, because they had people who really were very devoted to their welfare, and they didn't go into believing that a drug or that a particular treatment at some major Harvard hospital was the answer for them. And that these parents knew that there's only one person who really truly will advocate for my kids, and that's me. And so at the end, it's still about human connections and our brain as being part of human connections. So I learned about trauma at the VA. And the opening statement of my book, and I won't read it to you, I'll just read the first paragraph to give you a taste of what the book is about. The Tuesday after the 4th of July weekend 1978 was my first day as a staff psychiatrist at Boston Veterans Administration Clinic. As I was hanging a reproduction of my favorite Bruegel painting, as law of art in the book, the blind leading the blind on the office of my new office wall, I heard a commotion in the reception area down the hall. A moment later, a large, disheveled man in a stained three-piece suit, carrying a copy of Soldier of Fortune magazine under his arm, burst through the door. He was so agitated and so clearly hungover that I wondered how I could possibly help this hulking man. I asked him to take a seat and tell me what I could do for him. It turned out his name was Tom. His father was a soldier who had fought for Patton in the Second World War. And his father always treated him like he was really no good. And as he was growing up, his father would always say, "My friends who died in the Second World War were the good people. And whatever you do is not good enough in a way." So this kid who grew up in South Boston always wanted to prove to his dad that he was just as good as his dad's friends who died, and who seemed to be the only people who his dad was interested in. So he enlisted in the Marine Corps, and he made the top of his class, and he went to Vietnam, and on his second week in country, he was slugging through a rice paddy, and they went into an ambush, and everybody was killed except for him. And he had these searing images of people lying face down in the rice paddy, and he said, "I have become a monster. I blow up at my kids. My wife, who supported me as I was in Vietnam and wrote me letters every day, I don't have any feelings for her anymore. And she's a wonderful person, I know that, but I cannot love anybody anymore." And he told me about his nightmares. And so, as a medical student, I worked in a sleep laboratory, and I knew about nightmares. And doctors, of course, always hear what they have been taught, and not what their patients tell them. So I heard nightmares, and I'd done some research on nightmares. I said, "I can help you to make your nightmares go away. Here is a pill," a typical education that we all get. And a week later he comes back, and I triumphantly wait for him to pat me on the shoulder and say, "Boy, you're a great doctor." And I said, "So how was my pill?" And he said, "I did not take your pill." And I said, "Oh my God, a non-compliant patient, bad." So I said, "So why didn't you take my pill?" And he said, "I realized that if my nightmares go away, the death of my friends will not be remembered, and their death will be in vain." And that statement completely blew me out of the water. And at that moment, I knew I would spend the rest of my professional career thinking about trauma and how people get stuck on something a long time ago that keeps them from moving on with their life. And that issue continues to really preoccupy me, because since that time I've met thousands of people, and the clinic we have met thousands of people who get stuck and who do not seem to be able to go on. And so what is it that keeps people stuck? and what allows people to begin to move on again. And what I realized very early on is that trauma is not an issue that has to do with the past primarily, but trauma has something to do is that the past becomes overly important and bleaches out the present. And that the great challenge of overcoming trauma is to be fully alive right now at 7 o'clock in Acton, Massachusetts, and say, I am here, and that's the only thing that counts, and not to keep sort of wondering about other things out there. So that became the great issue. What also was interesting is that at that time, this is 1978, that's before we had a diagnostic manual. And so we just sort of did things by the seat of our pants. I went down to the library of the VA and I looked for books on war neuroses and war stuff and trauma, and there was not a single book at the VA that had anything to do with war trauma. It had been forgotten. And it was several years later that I realized that there was a voluminous literature on war trauma in German after the Franco-German War of 1870, after the First World War, in France after people studied sexually abused women in the 1870s, and that these issues of knowing and not knowing keep revolving and keep being forgotten. And so there was a big literature by 1904, and then Pierre Babinski, who the doctors among you remember from medical school, the toe man, he didn't like these people who studied trauma, so he kicked out all of the people who were interested in trauma. And so it disappeared. Then the First World War breaks out, and shell shock is discovered. And what I didn't know, and part of the glory of writing a book is you really do a lot of research, is that I discovered there was an order from the British General Staff in 1916 that said that no doctor, no physician will be allowed to use the word shell shock after today, and we will suppress any further information being published in scientific journals about shell shock because it will undermine the war efforts. And funny things you discover, because before every war, people go rah, 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 isn't this wonderful? And then people go home and people always get forgotten. And people don't want to invest money in the survivors because they want to invest money in the new rah, 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 let's kill a few more people. And so what people don't know, or very few people know, is that in 1933, at the height of the Depression, the First World War veterans were, as a group, largely unemployed. And Congress had voted that they would get a pension starting in 1945. 30 years after the end of the First World War. But these guys are now unemployed, and so they camp out on the mall in Washington, D.C. in order to petition Congress, can we please get our pensions 15 years earlier, because we are starving and our families are starving. And they camped out for 3 months, and at the end of 3 months, the army troops move in under General Pershing, who led us in the First World War, assisted by Captain Patton, later on General Patton, and Captain Eisenhower with the cavalry, who blasted these veterans out of the Mall of Washington, D.C. and drove them home so they wouldn't get their pensions. So very quickly, when you learn about trauma, you learn about how this is all embedded in society and embedded in the denial that people need to have about the impact of trauma on people's lives. And so we learn about trauma. And one of the first things that I learned is that we gave Rorschach tests on people. I bet most of you have heard about Rorschach, they're silly ink blot tests. And that was the first implication that I got, is that when people see some meaningless ink blot, where most people see butterflies or dancing monks, traumatized people see blown up bodies or torn flesh. And what became very clear is that something has changed in the way they look at the world. And that when you deal with traumatized people, how you see the world is really quite irrelevant, because the way that they see the world is very different, and over time we got to really do a lot of research, and that's still going on to this day, to see to what degree the brains of traumatized people are changed to live in a different world. They see things differently. They don't see things that other people see, and they do things that other people don't see. And so their whole brain, their mind, their perception of the world is changed. And then the question is, how do you help them to be focused on the present and to be fully alive right now? The second chapter is called Revolutions in Understanding Mind and Brain. And I like the two opening quotes. The first opening quote is, "The greater the doubt, the greater the awakening. The smaller the doubt, the smaller the awakening. No doubt, no awakening." Keep that in mind as you listen to the primaries tonight. And the other quote is a quote by Robert Penn Warren, who I happen to have met because the person who started the Trauma Center with me, Nina Fish-Murray, who actually died a week ago at age 97, was a good friend of Robert Penn Warren, and I met him there. And what he writes is that you live through the little piece of time that is yours, but that piece of time is not only your life, it's a summing up of all the other lives that are simultaneous with yours. What you are is an expression of history. And I imagine there's quite a few people in this room who are beginning to be old enough to be very aware of that. If you lived in 1968, you're a child of 1968. And people who were not alive in 1968 have a different consciousness, have a different awareness. People who grew up discovering marijuana, discovering the Beatles, discovering things for the first time, have a different mindset than people who were born 20 years later. You know it for your own kids. My kids, good as they are, live in a different perceptual world than I do, and I'm sure your kids also do. And so we all live in different cultural contexts, and my particular take on trauma is very much the product of how my colleagues and I, my friends and I, and my enemies and I got together to organize something and to articulate something that's a product of our time. And it's very striking at the Trauma Center, where I'm by far the oldest person right now, is that most of the younger people have a different conception of life. They live in a different feeding ground. They grow up in a different garden. And one of the disadvantages of that is that because I've reviewed so much science over the past 150 years, is that what you see, every young scientist wants to discover new stuff. And so they do this research and they send it to scientific peer-reviewed journals, and one of the worst things that can happen is that it lands on my desk and some young scientist says, "Oh, I've just made this amazing discovery that trauma has something to do with your body being unable to move." And I go, "Yeah, you can read the papers by Harvey Mazer from 1953 and the paper by so-and-so in 1927, because by and large, people really don't discover a lot of new things, basically what we do, because everybody before us has also been very smart, and we all keep rediscovering things and then thinking that we did. Now, what I start talking about here is, again, a big revolution in psychiatry. And one of the great experiences I had in my life is that I took a year off between my first and second year of medical school, which was at the height of the Vietnam War. I was very upset and confused about the Vietnam War. I didn't know if I wanted to continue to live here. I didn't know if I wanted to continue to study medicine. And in the context of that, I got a job at the first ward that was studying the effect of drugs on first break schizophrenic patients. And I was the head of recreation. So I took people camping and sailing and baseball games, and it had nothing to do with the science, etc., while people were making a very important discovery, namely, if you give people with first psychosis drugs, they do much better than if you talk to them. And that's not what I did. The study was going on. And so I lived on that ward for 8 months. I lived with people who were psychotic, young people, about my age, 22, 23-year-old people. And I lived with them. And I got to really be embedded in the world of young people in trouble. I had an amazing experience 2 nights ago. I went to watch a movie called Trumbo, which I can highly recommend. It's a fantastic movie about the blacklisting in Hollywood. I know about Trumbo and I know about the blacklisting in Hollywood because one of the Hollywood 10 was a patient on my ward who told me all about her family was blacklisted and what effect it had. And the other thing that happened is that because as a ward attendant you have no pretenses and people are not scared of you as the way they are of doctors, they tell you stuff. And usually they tell you stuff late at night when they cannot sleep. And so many of the people who were there told me a story in the middle of the night of having been molested and having been abused. And one example I give in the book is there was this very sexy young thing on the ward who wasn't eating, and she, everybody's a little skittish around her because she was the girlfriend of a famous Boston mafioso, and so she was this cool person. Well, you know her, and she refused to eat. And what do you do in the medical ward? You try to help people who don't want to eat, and they will starve if they won't eat. So we were told by the head nurse, you have to hold her down with 4 people and put a tube down her throat so that she can be fed through a throat tube. That's what people do. And then later on she tells me that she had been sexually abused by her uncle and her brother, and that we managed to precisely repeat her trauma on her that had been done to her before. And we do that a lot. Our people have been traumatized, have an amazing capacity to get into situations where the same thing keeps happening to them over and over again. And somehow we become part of these systems.
I can really relate to that. My sister struggled with anxiety and rejection, and I didn't understand why until I realized I was unintentionally repeating the same patterns of behavior that had hurt her with her ex. It was a wake-up call to be more aware of the deeper issues people are carrying and to approach them with empathy and understanding. Yeah, Bessel van der Kolk's experience really struck home for me, especially that part where he talked about unintentionally re-traumatizing someone while trying to help. It brought me right back to a time with my sister, actually. She went through some really intense trauma in her past, an abusive relationship that left her struggling with trust and feeling safe. And me, I thought I was being a good sibling by constantly pushing her to get back on her feet. I thought, you just need to be strong, move on, that kind of thing. But looking back, I was so wrong. There was this one time, she was supposed to come to this family gathering, and I kept pushing her to go, telling her it would be good for her to be around people and not isolate herself. I didn't understand how much anxiety that was causing her. Then one night, after I'd really been on her case, she finally opened up. She said the way I was pushing her reminded her of how her ex used to force her into things she wasn't ready for, how he'd control her. And hearing that, it crushed me. I realized I was doing the exact opposite of helping. I was unknowingly making her feel trapped all over again, just like van der Kolk's story, where they tried to feed that woman through a tube, not realizing they were repeating her trauma. It made me rethink everything, how sometimes when we think we're being supportive, we're actually just adding to the weight someone's carrying. That experience with my sister, much like Bessel's experience with his patient, taught me that healing doesn't from forcing someone to confront their pain on our timeline. Sometimes it's about just being there, letting them heal at their own pace without becoming another source of pressure in their life. That's why his story hit so hard for me. it's easy to forget that trauma doesn't respond to a quick fix or pushing people to move on. And sometimes the best thing you can do is simply listen and let them guide how they want to heal. My sister didn't need a lecture about strength. She needed me to be patient and understand that her version of healing looked different from what I imagined.
So I get to understand something about how trauma starts sort of finding its way into mental illness in all kinds of different varieties. And I think a lot about what's going on, and it's also the time that we're beginning to learn about the brain. And we learn a bunch of things about chemicals of reward, chemicals of fear, chemicals of modulation. We learn about opioids. And so when we start being able to measure these things and start being able to give people drugs that help them, I very enthusiastically joined that crowd, and I did the first study on clozaril in schizophrenia as a young man. I did the first study on Prozac for PTSD, the first study on Zoloft and PTSD, and we thought we had it licked, because what happens is that we all are totally dominated by the technology that is available to us. So back in the 1970s, 80s, we learned to measure chemicals, and because we can measure chemicals, the world becomes a chemical world, and everything gets redefined as the mental illness is a chemical illness. And many of you still have heard that and believe that. It turns out that all these billions of dollars that were spent on understanding the chemical basis of mental illness basically was wasted. We learned almost nothing. And mental illness is not a chemical illness. We can give people drugs that can change their behavior, but so tomorrow I'm going to go to Columbia Medical School because we're invited to begin to revamp the curriculum there, and one of my fellow members of my small group is Robert Whittaker, who wrote a book recently called The Anatomy of an Epidemic, where he shows that it is very likely that the drugs that psychiatrists give to people momentarily give relief, but if it continues to be given to people, it may actually prolong and aggravate the illness, and that since we have introduced drugs into people's lives, the prognosis of most major mental illnesses has gone down instead of up. So that there's a really major problem in the drug-oriented culture of psychiatry that is being discussed usually in the lay public, but not so much in the center of psychiatry. But those days of learning how to measure chemicals are fantastically heady, because psychiatry has always been this nebulous profession of people talking about feelings and talking about intimacy and relationships and stuff, and now suddenly we can become scientists, and we get laboratories, and we get funds, and well, my early days were all spent in the basements of various hospitals. As we start getting money to study all that stuff, we start moving up in the floors of the hospital. At some point, when you get enough money from the drug companies, you get to be on the 7th floor. And the person who gets the most money from the drug companies gets the biggest and largest office. I know that very well from experience. And so the chemical revolution takes place and takes over our profession. And it's become a very sad thing, because over time, chemistry starts running things, and the results of chemistry are disastrous. They're very bad for our society. And so the poorer you are, the more likely you are to get medications that will blunt your emotions, blunt your capacity to learn, and a very straight line. So people in Acton, or kids in Acton who are messed up, are probably about least likely to get psychiatric medications, but the poorer you get, the more likely you are, when you're a pain in the ass, for people to just say, take this pill and make it go away. It is a gigantic public health issue, because these drugs that help kids not to be pains in the asses also affect the dopamine system of the brain. The dopamine system of the brain is the motivation system of the brain. the same thing that makes you angry, excited, and stuff is also the thing that makes you excited about learning and engaging in new relationships. And when you take these drugs that block the dopamine system, you have much less interest in things around you. And if you spend your childhood on dopamine blockers, the likelihood that you'll ever be a productive member of society is pretty slim. So that's, it hasn't gone well. And that's the next chapter. And it's the whole thing about being at the right place at the right time. And the trauma center is the right time at the Massachusetts General Hospital, just as Harvard acquires its first neuroimaging equipment. And the guy who runs the neuroimaging laboratory, Scott Rausch, who's now the head of McLean, calls me up. And one of the first studies he wants to do is to see what traumatized brains look like. And he says, can you get a bunch of people who would be willing to have their brains scanned? And so we get into a new technology, the great new technology of the day, and that's to see what happens in people's brains. We have learned a lot what happens in people's brains, and much of it has not been applied to good therapy yet. But again, it's sort of been this funny thing that now that we can image people's brains, you don't count unless you image people's brains. Huh? So I'm into dancing, and I'm into theater, and I'm into yoga stuff, and we did some brain scans with yoga, and showed that the brain changes with yoga. But now everybody feels like they're not truly valid people until there's a brain scan that shows that whatever you do changes the brain. Don't worry about it. Just try to help people to do better. And so we learned about the brain. The study we do on the brain is interesting because we look at something, we find something that's very interesting, namely that when you go back into your trauma, the back part of your brain, the part of your brain that has to do with your survival, that we have in common with all animals, that has no capacity to think, but it's just your survival brain that makes you eat and fight and take care of yourself in an animalistic way, is hyperactivated when people enter their trauma. And the front part of the brain that has to do with cognition, understanding, figuring things out, is actually sort of largely wiped out. And the more you get into your trauma, the less you can think and reason and understand. And so we show that, and it's been shown up by numerous other studies since that time. But what's fascinating is that as we learn more about the brain, the prevalent treatment that psychologists and psychiatrists are doing is cognitive behavioral treatment. Namely, let's think about what's going on here, let's figure out what's going on here, and let's understand it, and let's help you to help you with your distorted cognitions. I have tried it on my wife and on my children, on Marla. Marla has tried it on me. We try to always correct each other's distorted cognitions. How's it going? Not so well, because these very deep feelings that people have are not cognitive feelings. Like we have now all these anger management problems to help you to understand how bad it is to beat people up. And it's a very good program for as long as you don't get angry, it really works. But the moment you get angry, that part of your brain disappears and you keep doing the same thing. And so what we learn is that in order to change people's orientation, once you get traumatized and you start perceiving the world as a terrifying and dangerous place, you need to actually work with that core survival part of the brain, and the cognitive frontal lobe can sort of help you to figure out why you might be so screwed up. But understanding why you are screwed up does not make you less screwed up. It makes you understand why you're screwed up. And understanding why you're screwed up is helpful, because then you can maybe say, oh, every time I get close to somebody that happens to me, so maybe I can start working on that issue in other ways of dealing with that. And so it's very useful to understand yourself and to know what's going on with you, but it's just the first step to begin to take care of that primitive animal brain that keeps you getting you into trouble. And so slowly we learn that there's really only two ways in which you can change that basic arousal, survival part of your brain. One of them is bottom up, by the way you breathe and the way you move. So dancing, moving, rhythmical activities. The people who really understand that, of course, are kindergarten teachers. Kindergarten teachers know everything because they deal with little kids who have hardly any frontal lobe, and they have these little frontal lobes that go on, but you need to be modulated all day. So what do you do with little 4 and 5-year-olds? You do rhythmical things, and you blow bubbles, and you do activities that calms that limbic system down, and you organize it, and you set limits, and basically they get it right. And that's about what we need to do with all traumatized people also, is to just breathe and move and get those basic rhythms going as you do in 5-year-olds. There is a frontal part of the brain over here that helps you to really get in control over yourself. And so what people find out is that the side part of the brain is geared to do what I do with you right now. Explaining things, talking, same part of the brain that will be used in the Republican primaries. So the talking part of the brain is not there to tell the truth. It's to tell a story, to have fun with other people, to get along with other people, to get people to vote for you, to get people to buy your book, stuff like that. So the frontal part of your brain is there to talk and to create ideas, but those ideas do not need to have anything to do with reality. It's a social brain. But there's another part of our frontal lobe, of our conscious brain, that runs through the middle. It's called the mohawk of the brain. And it runs right here through the middle. Various brain structures, all the way from back to front. And those actually allow you to start getting control over that very primitive arousal system. And that mohawk of the brain is involved in noticing yourself, feeling yourself, something that we call interoception, experiencing your inner world. And so slowly, we and a large number of people who are into this field slowly start drifting out of mainstream thinking into a new way of thinking. So the mainstream of thinking is the Northern European way of thinking. As I look around this room, it's a fairly undiverse crowd, you may have noticed that also. So most of you come from a similar ethnic background as I do. And so people who come from our ethnic background basically come from a culture that is where if you feel bad, you take a swig. That's the white people's culture. If you feel bad, you go, and that culture comes across the Atlantic and is still our mainstream culture. You see it on television. I shot my television, so I don't know what television looks like, but it's probably the same stuff. And the television says, are you depressed? Ask your doctor for Zoloft. Are you depressed? Can't you sleep? Ask your doctor for Lunesta. And what the ads don't say, because it would be anti-American or anti-European or anti-white people's culture, is that when you're depressed, you can do things to make you feel better because you have inbuilt self-regulatory structures in your brain, which happens to be not part of white people's culture. And then in 1992, I go to China for the first time, right after Tiananmen Square, and it's a miserable place. It's miserable. They hate us. We grow to hate them. Now, since that time, they've sort of tried to play nicely nice, but it was a lousy place. And they serve us lunch with wet, cold tablecloth. If you really actually want to insult your guests, just put a wet tablecloth on their laps, and you'll feel really honored by them. And let you wait for 5 hours, stuff like that. So I'm really unhappy in Beijing, and I sit in my hotel room and I look down to the park below me, and I see 10,000 Chinese going, what the hell are those people doing? I have nothing to do, I'm homesick. I go, you feel so much better afterwards. I think, wow, these Chinese know something we don't know, that there's certain movements that seem to activate some damn thing in your body that seem to calm you down. And then I go to India, there's a whole bunch of people saying like, India is not a hard place. I wouldn't recommend anybody to live there because, so how do you survive in India? You gotta, and it also changes your brain. So and then I'm part of the Tooth Commission in South Africa, and I travel around with Bishop Tutu, and that actually was the most interesting experience of my life because what happened in South Africa is that 4 million people who happen to share my genetics have been horribly oppressing 40 million black people. And now things are going to change. And after you have been oppressed for 40 years and you have seen your relatives murdered, what do you want to do? You want to kill the bastards. And Mandela and Tutu get together and say, you know, we'd like to kill the bastards also, but if we do, our country will be born in bloodshed. And if our country is born in bloodshed, we'll never make it. And so they set up the Truth Commission in South Africa. And the Truth Commission in South Africa was not to bring truth to black people, it's to save the white people from being killed, basically. And you know what it did? It saved the white people from being killed. And how did they do it? Is that Tutu was the best trauma therapist I've ever seen. He understood trauma therapy. And he had people tell their stories, but even more so, he'd be in a gathering like this. I traveled around with him. And before doing anything, we'd sing together. And when you sing together, which I hope you'll do for Christmas in the next few weeks, you feel so much better. And you start giggling. And you start feeling like, wow, what a cool people. We're all singing together. And they do a little dancing. And they dance together. And you feel like, hey, nice. And then people sit down and they start telling their trauma stories. And everybody falls apart. And Tutu goes like, let's sing. And they sing. They calm themselves down. And they dance. And they go back and tell another piece of the trauma story. And slowly, because he was able to magnificently regulate the arousal systems of a very large number of people, people felt understood. And they felt safe. And they felt that people would take care of things. And there was completely no bloodshed during the transformation of South Africa. The last time I was in South Africa, I was invited by an organization, I didn't quite know who it was, and I have dinner in their houses. This is 2008, I think, 2007 it was. And they say, let's bring out a toast to President Bush. I say, is it okay if I sit this one out? Like some of you, you may not have such positive feelings about the invasion of Iraq and our having killed 200,000 people because we got pissed off about the World Trade Center. And the next thing they say is, we got screwed by the Truth Commission. I go, oh boy, I'm in the wrong company. They owe their life to the Truth Commission. The only reason that they didn't get killed is because Bishop Tutu controlled the rage of the people in South Africa, the justified rage. I'll tell you another Truth Commission story. So I'm at a reception with Nelson Mandela and other people, and so like we. And so I talk to him, and I say, you know, I'm a trauma specialist, and I'm part of your Truth Commission, and you know, I've read about you, and I know that you were the head of the terrorist army before they sent you to Robben Island. I mean, I didn't have a reputation of really being Mr. Nice Guy. And I don't quite know how I said it, but somehow I didn't alienate him. And then you go to Robben Island, and you come out this amazing, enlightened person. What do you think was it about Robben Island that transformed you from a very angry man into this enlightened person? And without hesitation he says, boxing. And I say, boxing? He said, yeah, when you box, you need to know precisely where you are, you know precisely where the other person is, You need to anticipate what the other person is going to do. You need to anticipate what your body is going to do. You need to anticipate how your body can react to it, and you need to set up very complex circuits of anticipation and interaction with the person you're dealing with in order to survive. And I go, actually, those are exactly the circuits of the brain that are damaged by trauma, where you no longer can interact in a really attuned way with the people around you. And so we don't have boxing programs at the trauma center, but I'm on the board of directors of a group called Impact Model Mugging, where they treat they take traumatized women who have been raped and molested, and they teach them karate. And they teach them how to be really focused. And these are people who tend to feel very helpless and frozen. And when you're helpless and shy and frozen, you actually are quite a target for people who want to hurt people and want to steal people, because you look like a pushover. And so they teach these women to actually stand up straight and to look and to become mindful and to activate that core part, the self-observing part of your brain, the medial prefrontal cortex, where you really keep calm as you notice what goes on. And as people become calm, they start learning karate. And they start being confronted with people who attack them and they push them. And during the graduation ceremony, they basically set up a scene that symbolizes the scene of the trauma. And instead of being helpless and frozen this time, they take action and poke the guy's eyes out, or kick the shin from underneath him, and he falls to the floor and said, "I did it." And so overcoming trauma is about really regaining your power and becoming fully alive and saying, "I can do it. I'm not helpless." And so a large part of that is really regaining a sense of being in your body, owning your body, and owning a sense of, I can do it and I'm in charge of my life. Let me just finish because time is beginning to run out. I'm on about page 4 of the book at this point. Is Joe, did you hear Joe laugh? Is Joe here? There he is. He always sits in the back. So here's an example of what we do. So part of my favorite trauma treatment is very interesting. So actually I'll tell you the whole story. The whole story is that I already hinted that not all my children were completely perfect children when they came into the world. And one of my kids is, at some point when he's a young adolescent, very frozen, and he doesn't want to go to school, and he's shy, and he has chemical sensitivities, and he has no friends, and we're just worried, like unbelievably worried. And then we realized that even though he's just too weak to go to school and too messed up to go to school, around 5 o'clock in the evening he gets a little energy. And so we decided to sign my son up for an improv class to have some stuff with other kids. And he likes improv. He likes to move with kids. He doesn't have to talk, which is great, because he feels very ashamed of himself. And then they start playing the West Side Story. And as he is assigned the role of Rocket in the West Side Story, I see him walk through the house going, I think, oh, he is trying to see what it's like to be a gang member rather than a frozen, scared little kid lying in his bed all day. And so he gets to play this role in the West Side Story. And the great reward, of course, when you're a cool guy, is that the girls love you. And so he gets to discover a whole new thing, that it's really nice when girls love you. And so his next role is the Fonz in Happy Days. And I attribute the transformation of my son, who is actually doing very well, to his theater program. In that his body got to feel what it's like to be a different person than the identity that he had assumed through years of particular things. And that's the sort of program that Joe is running right now through JRI in our trauma program. Actually, we did at some point did some research on it, funded by the Centers for Disease Control. So let me just, there's so many things, because you need to really understand trauma to break out of this paradigm of helplessness and frozenness and identity confusion issues and really regain power over your life. But as the work went on and we learned more and more about trauma, we also learned slowly how severely damaged the brain becomes from chronic fear and helplessness. And we did a little work on it, but much more is the work of my friend Marty Teicher at Harvard, who has been spending a lot of time looking at the brain tracks that go wrong. And when you see how much damage there actually is, you want, to what degree, talking, movement, action, breathing can actually make a difference.
Bessel van der Kolk's story about the Truth Commission and how they used singing and dancing to help people process their trauma, it really hit me because it reminded me of something I went through with my mom. She's been through a lot of trauma, though she rarely talks about it. For years, I could see how it affected her, like this heavy cloud that was always there, but no one really acknowledged. She was always on edge, quick to snap, and there were times when she'd just shut down completely, like she couldn't handle anything. And for the longest time, I didn't know how to help her. I'd try to get her to open up, but it never worked. She'd say, "I don't want to talk about it." And that was that. And honestly, I felt helpless. But one day, almost out of nowhere, she started going to this dance class with some friends. At first, I thought it was just a hobby, something to get her out of the house, but it became so much more. She wasn't just going to dance. She was reconnecting with herself, her body, her emotions. I could see the change. She started smiling more, seemed lighter. When she'd come home from class, she'd be almost glowing. It was like she was finding a way to let go of all that bottled up tension. And it wasn't until later, when we were sitting on the porch one evening, that she finally told me how much it helped. She said that dancing made her feel safe in her body again, something she hadn't felt in years. She didn't have to talk about her trauma to heal. She just needed to move, to feel her body in a way that wasn't tied to fear or pain. That's when I realized that trauma isn't always about the words. It's about the body too. You can carry trauma physically, and sometimes the path to healing is through movement, not just talking. It was like what van der Kolk said about Mandela and boxing, or those women learning karate. My mom wasn't fighting anyone or reliving the trauma directly, but through dancing, she was learning how to feel in control again, how to be present in her own skin. It was as if every step, every rhythm, helped her reclaim a part of herself that trauma had taken away. And seeing that, watching her rediscover joy and peace through something as simple as dancing, taught me that healing looks different for everyone. Sometimes it's not about confronting the trauma head on. It's about finding ways to reconnect with the parts of yourself that got lost along the way. For my mom, it was dancing. For someone else, it could be art or running or yoga, anything that helps you feel alive and in control of your own body again. So yeah, when van der Kolk talks about using singing and dancing to help people in South Africa process their trauma, it made so much sense to me. Trauma isolates you. It makes you feel disconnected from others and from yourself. But when you move, when you engage with your body in a safe, joyful way, it can open the door to healing in a way that words alone sometimes can't. I saw it firsthand with my mom, and it's something I'll never forget.
And basically, what we discover, or what the field discovers as a whole, is that when you're chronically frightened, you cannot really make use of therapy because you're too scared. You don't have words, and you don't know who you are, and you're you cannot focus and you cannot pay attention. It's a very important part of the work that we've been doing, is to really spell out the pervasive nature of early childhood trauma and abuse on people's minds and the brain. And so most of our therapeutic interventions are not all that helpful when people cannot talk and form relationships. And about 7 years ago, we learned about neurofeedback. And we learned about a technique that's been around for quite a long time, for several years now, but it's much helped by the fact that our computers are getting smaller and our technology is getting faster, and that is that you can learn to play computer games with your own brain. You can put an electrode on your head, you can project your brain waves on a computer screen. I used to work in a sleep laboratory as a medical student. There's about the size of this room with multi-million dollars worth of instruments. I have as much instruments in my office for $10,000 as that gigantic laboratory had back in the 70s. And we have the same instruments at the trauma center. And we learn that people can learn to, so you can project your brainwaves on the screen, and then you can set computer games in such a way that if you make a different configuration of brainwaves that help you to be more attentive and more calm, that you get rewards for your computer game. So you can basically play computer games with your own brain and gradually so change your own brainwaves. This, to my mind, is a hell of a lot more useful than drugs, because drugs go everywhere, and here we can really quite pinpoint particular brainwaves that get in the way of people being focused and attentive. And so we've done 3 studies now, and with remarkably good results. And so the current study we're running, and I think I was supposed to bring that up here, so I'm doing it, we're planning actually to open up a site for our current study here at Acton, aren't we? Or we're hoping to, huh? And so the study we have been doing in the last year or so is of 8 to 12-year-old kids. Many of them are kids who have been adopted, kids in foster care, and one of the things we see a lot of kids like that at the trauma center, and one of the things we run into is that, you know, when you're a foster parent or adoptive parent, you think the basic approach is basically, I'm a wonderful and loving person. And you probably are. And you think that if I take this really messed up, angry, frozen kid into my room, sooner or later my wonderfulness and my love will rub off on this kid, and this kid will become just as wonderful and loving as I am. The sad news is, it doesn't work that way. And that once your brain has been set in certain positions that people aren't safe, and people aren't fun, and that relationships aren't pleasurable, it's extraordinarily difficult to actually activate those pathways in the brain. And we know that these pathways are now severely damaged. And so, to my mind, our long-term project actually is to work on the most affected traumatized kids and adults who are traumatized as kids, to help them to rewire these brainwaves. And so if you're interested in that, talk to Marla, I think, about, she'll put you in touch with how to, if you know any kids who think you would benefit from that, do that. We also have an adult clinic on that, and so people can call the clinic and get services that way as adults. So we do that as well. And we do many other things. And so my book sort of spells out what happens in the brain, what happens in the mind, and then I have a long series of chapters about all kind of things that most of which we have researched, so we have very good data on it, because we are researchers. We like to do outrageous things, like we find out some weird brain abnormality, and then we think, oh, maybe yoga can change the brain abnormality, so we work a bunch of years to set up a yoga clinic with Dave Emerson and his colleagues, and then we go to NIMH and we did the first study on yoga for PTSD. And there's a lot of hard work, but after we finished the study, it turned out that yoga is probably a more effective treatment for PTSD than any medication that anybody has ever studied. The American Psychiatric Association was not delighted with that piece of research. We did get it published in a very respectable journal, but it finally came out. I couldn't find it. Every psychiatrist gets this journal in the mail, and I couldn't find the article. And it turned out it was in the special section of the article of that journal that you can only access if you pay $35, and then you can actually see that article. See, it's a little bit like the pornography at the Vatican. They keep it under lock and key. You have to pay extra to get to see it. The fact is, yoga is not like pornography. It actually helps people tremendously, and it's very helpful to manage stress. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Remember, it's okay to not be okay. It's a sign of strength, not weakness, to acknowledge your struggles and seek support. We all go through difficult times, and it's important to remember that you're not alone. There are people who care, who understand, and who want to help. So don't hesitate to reach out, share your story, connect with others, and find the support you need. And remember, it's okay to take things one day at a time. Healing is a journey, not a destination. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment on this video. Your support means the world to us. And if you're struggling, know that there are resources available. Reach out, share your story, and let's work together to build a more compassionate and understanding world. Thank you for watching Inside Serene. Together, we'll find our serenity.